Mac OS and Docker. It's what I've been using since Docker Desktop came out 5+ years ago, and I'm going to walk you through the setup and a few tweaks you might want to check out. In this video, very similar to the Windows one, we have a few steps we need to go through. In Mac, we don't have to worry so much about BIOS settings or virtualization and all that. It just tends to work. That's great. And then we have a Linux shell or a Bash and ZSH type shells already in Mac. So a lot of the requirements for Docker are just to install it. It just works as long as your Mac is, I don't know, at least less than 5 years old at this point, 5, 6, 7. It probably goes back as long as you have one of the last 2 or 3 major OSs. Docker tends to support multiple versions of Mac going back in time. So you should be fine there. And I'm mentioning Docker Desktop because it is, I still think, the best way on Mac to run Docker. There are lots of other options out there, but they all have a subset of the features and functionality that Docker Desktop gives you. So I'd recommend you just stick with the best. And with Mac, you really only get 2 options here. You're either on an Intel Mac or an Apple M1 Silicon processor. So Apple Silicon, ARM, M1, whatever the term is you want to use for it. If you're using one of those, just make sure you don't download the Intel and you download the M1 version, or it may not even work. And of course, like every other Mac app, when you download them from the internet as a DMG, you just take that little app over there and you copy it into the folder I'm in. And as a reminder, Docker Desktop is always free for learning. Now, there's tons of open source throughout this course. Nothing in this course you have to buy. There's nothing in here that you should have to pay for other than the computer you're running it on. And Docker Desktop does have an enterprise tier where you will need to pay for it in an enterprise setting for corporate use. But in this case, we are specifically using it for learning. And I've gotten permission or verification from the top management at Docker that that's the intention, is that it's free to learn, free for individual use, and free for small business. It's only once you get into the enterprise that you need to pay for it. So even if you work in one of those big enterprises and you want to use Docker Desktop for learning, then you're safe. You can read through the user license agreement, but you're going to come to this screen, which is to accept the license, and you can read through there. It's mostly to alert you to the licensing change that Docker did a while back that requires enterprises to now pay for it. And Docker likes to bring up its dashboard when it's starting, and this is a GUI that allows you to do some of the things in Docker without having to use the command line, although we will focus largely on the command line in this course. But once it's starting up, you'll see this screen, and you'll notice the orange below. That means that Docker or Kubernetes, which you can enable in here, and we'll do that later in the course, these tools will need a startup time because in the background, they're starting a little VM inside of Mac to run a Linux kernel. Mac doesn't run a Linux kernel, it runs a slightly different kernel based on BSD, and that's not really compatible with Docker. We really need a Linux kernel running in a little VM. So Docker creates a nice, lightweight, low energy usage VM, which you can also pause from the menu. And when it's finally started, this little bar down here will go green, and you'll see some stuff over there. And you'll notice a new icon up here in the menu at the top. Hello. And you'll notice this is the Docker logo. It is actually Moby. He has a name. He also has a pink whale named Molly, which you'll probably hear trivia about throughout this course. But this is the little icon you need to pay attention to because it's a quick access to the dashboard, to log in, to change the preferences, to pause it when you're not using it, and then to quit it when you're done. And in that menu or in the full dashboard, you'll want to create a free Docker ID at hub.docker.com and log in there, create that account, get the account ID and password. The account ID is not your email address. It is your account ID. Log into Docker. So when you do that in Docker Desktop, Docker needs to pull the software we're going to run. It's much like a download or like a git clone or git pull. It's going to copy that stuff down off the internet, and you have a number, I think it's somewhere around 100 per 6 hours that you can download, and you probably won't download that many in this course. But if you're on a corporate network, that corporate network might have everyone using the same IP to get to the internet, and that's what Docker's tracking for downloads. So log in with the free account. It'll give you more downloads per every 6 hours or whatever their algorithm is. And that just makes sure that you won't get a download limit exceeded when you're trying to download apps to load for the rest of this course. Now, Docker has some built-in first steps. You can feel free to do those in this screen here that you're seeing on the dashboard, but you bought this course. So you can also just ignore all of that, close down the dashboard, just click the little red dot at the top left, get rid of that, and then bring up your terminal, because that's what we're really going to use a lot in this course for learning Docker, then Compose and Kubernetes and all the things. Here's a few tweaks and setting changes you might want to do, not just for this course, but for general use. This is typically what I change on Mac when I've installed a fresh Docker desktop. I want to go change this stuff. Once you go into Preferences, and you should see the Resources area that will allow you to control the number of CPU, RAM, disk, swap, all these settings in Mac. The defaults will get you started, but typically when you start to run more advanced multiple container workloads that we'll learn later in the course, you might run out of memory, and you might even run out of disk space down here at the bottom. So consider moving these to somewhere higher. I tend to run at least half of the RAM I have in the system. It just depends on how many resources you have. When you start to feel like Docker's not working or getting slow, you might want to come in here and see if you need to raise these limits. And don't worry, if Docker's not using them, it won't use them. It won't hog these resources or reserve them. The disk itself over here actually limits its size to just the files it's using. So you can feel free to ratchet this up. I tend to go 100 to 200 gig, depending on how much free space I have. And it will shrink the VM'd hard drive whenever you're not using it or whenever it restarts. And right above me tends to be the other thing I like to change, which is experimental features. This will change every year or so once Docker's evolving. But on Mac OS, since we're running a Linux VM inside of our Mac, there are a few things that Docker has to do in the background to make this all work right. Of course, it's a virtual machine, so in this case, I've enabled the new virtualization support in the recent versions of Mac OS, which is supposed to be a little faster than the older version that Docker used to use. And this one right above me, the VirtuoFS, is a new feature in 2022. It may already be out of beta by the time you see this, but that feature I enable because it enhances the speed of my file access when I'm sharing files from my host into the container. You maybe don't understand all this yet. That's totally fine. Just feel free to enable these if you run into any problems, especially around performance and file access. VS Code or Visual Studio Code, if you haven't used it, there's a video later in this section that will explain some of the details on things I like about it. But VS Code is my go-to editor. You don't have to use any specific editor to edit Docker files or Kubernetes files in this course or in general. But Visual Studio Code has Docker add-ins, Compose add-ins, Kubernetes add-ins, all the add-ins for all the tools you're going to learn in this course. So it recognizes the file formats, it highlights the syntax inside the files, and generally is the tool I use every day. You will not be coding in this course, but using a development editor like VS Code does help in DevOps-like tasking for creating Docker files and all the other YAMLs that you will have to deal with. So I recommend it. You'll see more about that later. And just one little feature that I will talk again about later with VS Code is that it works on Linux desktops, Mac, and Windows. You can download it free from Microsoft for all three OSs, and you can sync the settings across all your setup. So I do that in order to have my settings synced on my Mac as well as my Windows machines and a Linux desktop that I have. Next on your to-do list is to download or clone the course repository from GitHub. And a reference link in this video, as well as a few lectures earlier, that was all the written information as well as all the links all in one nice place for you to download this stuff. But you're going to use a git clone command to copy this repository down to your local machine so you have all the sample files that you'll need throughout this course. And that's it. You've got Docker Desktop installed, you've got VS Code or your favorite editor. You can use whatever editor you want, but I will be using VS Code in this course. You've got Mac's built-in terminal that you can use for all the commands we're going to be typing, and you've cloned the repository down somewhere in your user directory, and you're ready to rock. Let's get going.